Hello, and welcome back to 50 States, 50 Murders, the podcast taking you, the listener, on an auditory road trip across all 50 states while we discuss 50 different murders. Thank you all for tuning in to episode 8. Dakota, where are we traveling to today?
We're going to be discussing a murder that took place in Tonasket, Washington.
If you have not tuned in to last week's episode, please be sure to do so. Last week we departed from Oregon and arrived in the state of Kansas. And this week we're going to depart from central USA as we're leaving Ark City, Kansas. And episode 8 takes us back to the Pacific Northwest. This week we're going to be traveling to Tonasket, Washington. Dakota, I hope you're comfortable because this fictitious drive is a 25-hour, 1,800-mile journey. As we get situated here in the state of Washington, we will be covering a murder that took place 14 years ago. Before diving into this week's case, let's make ourselves at home here in the state of Washington, covering the ins and outs, as well as some notorious murders that happen to take place here. Washington is nicknamed the Evergreen State. This nickname comes simply due to the abundance of evergreen forests. Washington is located in the Pacific Northwest, just below Canada, above Oregon, and bordering the Pacific Ocean. It's a murder podcast, so naturally, murder per capita, 35 at 3.9 murders per 100K. Dakota, I thought that number was a little surprising. We'll find out why here soon when you talk about your murders. A lot of serial killers that took place in Washington. I expect that number to be a little bit higher than it was.
That wasn't recent though, so
yeah, it was a while back.
Out there.
Yeah, it's if you live in Washington, things have slowed down. It's died down a little bit. Full pun intended. The state of Washington was named after the first U.S. president, George Washington. Dakota, I'm a dumbass. I actually didn't know that. Did you? Were you aware of that?
I probably could have guessed that.
I mean, I thought Washington, D.C. was named after George Washington. I didn't realize the state of Washington was named after him. So, I'm a dumbass. The state flag, it's a green flag with a picture of George Washington. Fun fact, out of all 50 states, it's the only state with a green state flag. And I feel like in the most basic explanation possible, the state of Washington, huge piece of land in the northwest corner of America, and the whole thing is just mountains, evergreen trees. But then in the middle, you have Seattle, Washington, which is where everyone lives, either in Seattle or the outskirts suburbs. A little bit about Washington. Washington currently ranks among the top states for life expectancy as well as low employment. One of the first states to legalize medicinal and recreational cannabis.
I knew that.
It's one of the first states to legalize same-sex marriage. And joining their neighbors below them in Oregon, Washington also legalized physician-assisted suicide. So, they have one of the highest life expectancies. Maybe you live to be too long. You're just ready to check out. Go get yourself a physician-assisted suicide in Washington. It's pretty cool. I like that. Major corporations such as Amazon and Microsoft, coffee powerhouse Starbucks, all from Washington. Are you a Starbucks guy or a Dunkin' Donuts guy?
I'm more of a Dunkin' Donuts guy, just for the donuts.
Okay, not a Starbucks guy. Let's talk about some things to do, some attractions that are featured in Washington. Let me see if I can sway you a little bit on your rankings for this week. So Washington, the number one attraction, it's the Olympic National Park. I think you'll like this. I know I would personally like this one. So checking several sources here, this is the number one thing to do when you're traveling to Washington. Get your backpack ready. There is 1,400 square miles national park that features rainforests, snow-capped mountains, as well as beaches, all in one park.
I'm familiar. A couple years back, you and the wife wanted to take a trip out west, and this was the place I actually was trying to talk her into going.
Yeah, I feel like you have to usually go to 3 different places to get forest, mountains, beaches, but you get all 3 of them in one right here. That's a pretty awesome park. I would definitely like to see that someday. Simply taking a few days if you choose to do so, just straight up visiting the city of Seattle. That's their number 2 attraction. You can take a ride on the Space Needle. There's countless restaurants, bars, breweries, live music. Cannabis is legal. I'm sure there's a bunch of cannabis shops. There's a lot of different museums, art exhibits. I'm sure that's right up your alley. And then this last one here I thought was pretty interesting, the San Juan Islands. So you have to take a ferry to get here, and it's a collection of 174 different islands, all featuring their own beautiful views, sceneries. You can eat at local shops. There's more hiking, kayaking, as well as whale watching. This is what really grabbed my attention. There is actually an orca island. You can just go out there and see real-life orcas in their natural habitat as opposed to a tank in the middle of Sandusky, Ohio.
Okay, there's no kayaking there, right? On the Orca Island?
I saw pictures of people kayaking next to orcas.
No, that's just stupid. They're the smartest animals. I don't see how that is legal, first of all.
Hey, kayak at your own risk.
You have to sign a waiver.
Were you a big fan of SeaWorld when it was around?
I went one time.
Really?
Yeah.
That's it? Okay.
Yep.
I used to love SeaWorld, but then, I watched Blackfish on Netflix.
Definitely changed my mind.
Yeah, yikes. That was rough. All right, so before we switch gears here, I got a little bit of a transition. You know this. I love music. I got to incorporate music here. Seattle, Washington, it was home to the grunge rock genre. It was a rock and roll genre that started in the mid-'80s but exploded in the early 90s. And if I had to stereotype it, long hair, flannel shirts, heroin, and just angry vocals. It was kind of a flash in the pan, but for the most part, pretty solid music. Do you have a favorite grunge rock and roll band?
No, that's not my type of music.
I mean, we got Nirvana, Pearl Jam, Alice in Chains, Soundgarden, a lot of pretty solid bands out there. But the reason why I bring this up, Nirvana's lead singer, Kurt Cobain. We're conspiracy guys. We're murder guys. Kurt Cobain committed suicide in 1994 in his Seattle home. Ruled to be a suicide. However, there's a lot of conspiracies that Kurt Cobain actually didn't kill himself and that it was possibly a murder. So there's a book that came out in 1998 called Who Killed Kurt Cobain? It went on to be an international bestseller, and it explored several different possibilities. And from my understanding, most of the book points towards his wife, Courtney Love, as either the murderer or someone who was heavily involved in the murder of Kurt Cobain. One of the conspiracies that he died of heroin overdose, but then there was a shotgun wound to cover up the OD. Thought that one was kind of weird. What's the point? Didn't really make sense to me. Nonetheless, it is a floating theory that's out there. There is a detective who has infamously claimed he was hired to kill Kurt Cobain for $50,000, and he was given a polygraph test by the world's best polygraphist, and he actually passed the test. Obviously, the more you go into this conspiracy, the more you'll find out, but then again, it's hard to say. I don't know if you had any chance to look into this. If you're familiar with the Kurt Cobain suicide, do you have any thoughts?
It's actually not a case that I've gotten real into, but I think at this point, most people believe that Courtney was involved in killing him instead of him killing himself.
Yeah, I think that's... I wouldn't be surprised, honestly. We'll probably never know.
That is a very popular conspiracy, though.
We're in Washington. We're now talking murders. We're in the Evergreen State. Why don't you go ahead and take it away? We have a lot of interesting serial killers from the state of Washington. What do we got?
Yeah, so it was hard to find single murders in the state because there are so many serial killers. There's been 8 that have had over 10 victims that have operated within its borders. And there was a 2-year stretch where 3 of them were active at the same time. So 1980 to 1981, those 2 years, that was bad time to be in Washington.
Yeah, rough. Life expectancy not as high back then.
Yeah, and these do not include Ted Bundy, who went to college in Washington and committed maybe up to 10 murders there. So that does not include him.
Washington was wild back in the day.
But who it does include is, I know we talked about Sam Little a little bit, but known as the most prolific serial killer in American history is the Green River Killer, because that's where he left his first 5 victims. For 16 years, Gary Ridgwright terrorized the state of Washington. He was convicted of 49 murders It was believed that his total was actually over 71. He targeted female prostitutes and would strangle them to death during sex. He was arrested in 2001, 3 years after his last murder, where he confessed to all the crimes. He admitted to killing so many women that he actually lost count. And as late as 2011, people that were hiking in wooded areas in Washington were still finding bodies of his victims.
Damn.
Yeah, they're just walking along finding a skull, and all of them lead back to Gary Ridgway.
It's like the geo-hunting, except it's just bodies.
Yeah. So it's very possible that there still remains of some of his victims that have yet to be found, and he's also still alive in prison. He's one of the few famous serial killers that is still alive. I know we talked about Dennis Rader.
Yep.
Yeah, those two are probably the two most popular that are still alive. So our next one is the Hillside Strangler. Alongside his cousin Kenneth Barachi, also known as the Hillside Strangler, he would kill 10 women. Most of his murders were in Los Angeles, but he moved to Washington, where he would kill 2 women on his own before he was caught. And he had a various way of killing his victims. His most popular was strangulation, just like Ridgway. But he also did a little bit of experimenting.
Oh, okay.
This sick fuck. He tried lethal injection, electric shock, and carbon monoxide poisoning.
Oh, man, this guy was twisted.
Yeah. So, speaking of twist, he actually wanted to become a cop. He acted as one to lure a lot of his victims in, and he even applied for a position in the middle of doing all these killings. And on multiple occasions, he was going on ride-alongs where they were looking for the Hillside Strangler.
Wow.
Yes.
Interesting.
So, going back to Dennis Rader, where he was installing the security system for people scared of the BTK killer, and this guy was looking for himself.
Okay. Interesting. So that's some infamous serial killers from the state of Washington. Yeah, the 80s were just a wild time to be in the state of Washington. Murder has definitely died down now, 35th murder per capita. So now that we've mentioned some things to do in the state of Washington, some infamous murderers, let's go ahead and jump into our case of the week. So Dakota, go ahead and kick us off with this week's story.
Okay, March 1st, 2009, on the side of a remote road, a body of an unidentified female was beaten and stabbed to death.
Okay, we got a Jane Doe this week.
Yeah, so I want to describe this road for a little bit. I tried getting on Google Maps. That's what I like to do. I like to find where the bodies were found. And I actually couldn't on this one because Google Maps does not reach to this road. I was able to get on a road that was on the side of a mountain, and then it kind of veered off into the road that our body is found on. But yeah, so it was pretty much up on a mountain. Now, her body was propped up against a fence at the end of a driveway, and there were small puncture wounds all over. And while propped up on the fence, her jacket and shirt were placed underneath her, which confused the police. Now, there was no identification, so the first course of action would to be to find out who it is.
Got to see who we got here.
Yeah, so on the scene, they got together a description, put out to the public, hoping that they could get help so they could actually start their investigation. A couple days went by before police got any calls, but they finally did from a Tracy Kitterman, who filed a missing police report for her daughter, and the description kind of matched her daughter. So there was a distinctive butterfly tattoo on her left shoulder, and that's what caught Tracy's attention. So from there, she went into the station, and she was able to confirm that it was her daughter, and the police were able to identify who it was.
This week, our Jane Doe is, in fact, Michelle Kitterman. Michelle Kitterman was a 25-year-old woman from Oroville, Washington. Oroville, Washington was about a 20-minute drive from where her body was found. According to her obituary, Michelle was a humorous person, someone who had a big heart. There was always an aura of kindness and caring to anyone she encountered. Michelle was a mother to a little boy, her son Nathan, and sadly at the time of her death, she was actually pregnant. The birth of Nathan, this was a moment in her life that changed everything. Before becoming a mom, she had a job working many modeling jobs. She was someone who was a natural on a runway. Michelle was on a professional career path of becoming, in fact, a runway model. Now, at the time of Nathan's birth, she gladly gave all of this away to take care of her son. As a single mother, she was doing various jobs, working odds and ends, doing whatever she needed to support Nathan and herself. To friends and family, she seemed like a perfect person on the surface. As we know, no one's perfect. We all have our secrets. And turns out she did have a little bit of a darker side, and that's something we're going to dive into later this episode.
Now I wanted to dive into the town that she was found in, Tonasket. We mentioned how remote the road was, but also the town as a whole was remote. It's very small. There isn't a single stoplight in the whole town, and everyone knows each other. The entire population is just over 1,000. So to put that in perspective, the high school we went to, there is 1,000 less students in the whole school, or 100, sorry, than there are in this whole town.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, and we didn't go to the biggest school. It was a D2 school. There's a lot of bigger ones out there.
Sure.
Yeah, so it wasn't by chance that a dead body was found. One of these 1,000 citizens had to have done it, or perhaps maybe more.
Someone had to have done it, or someone knows who did it. Let's jump to the autopsy. Around the time Michelle was identified, her autopsy was coming back. It was pretty disturbing, as she was stabbed over 30 times by what police believed to be an ice pick. And the force behind it was so strong the base of the pick left bruising on her body. As sick as that is, it's not even the worst part. Whoever did this was aware that she was pregnant, because there were wounds all around her stomach. It was an attack on her, but not only just her, but her unborn child.
Yeah, so let's get into the police investigation. Tracy Kitterman mentioned how Michelle had a boyfriend at the time. His name was Daniel Havoc. The problem with Daniel was that he was also a married man, making her believe that he was involved with the murder. Okay,
so we have a boyfriend who, as we've mentioned many times on the show, always going to be your first suspect. But my guy's also married to another lady.
Yeah. So upon questioning, he was very open with the police. He said that he was actually the father of the unborn child, and he was in the midst of choosing which woman he wanted to be with.
Okay, nice.
Yeah, so his alibi included being with his wife at the time, but he dropped Michelle off at a friend's house the day before that she was found dead, and that's all he was able to give to them.
Okay, suspect number one. I'm putting my chips on suspect number one thus far. We got the boyfriend / cheating husband. Very, very weird suspect to start off this case. Okay.
Yeah, he's got an alibi, and it's with his wife. Which,
why
don't you go ahead and get on his wife?
Okay, so let's jump to door number 2. We have Lacey Hurst Pavick. Lacey was then questioned by police because her husband used her as an alibi, and she was part of this love triangle that we have here today. She also was open with the police, and she said her husband had recently admitted to having an affair, and she was very angry about it, but she denied any involvement in this case. She then threw a name out to the police, Tansy Mathis. Tansy was the person who introduced Michelle and Daniel together.
Interesting. So our next suspect throws out another name. So let's get into suspect number 3, Tansy Mathis. She was a known drug dealer in the town of Tonasket, and people knew that trouble followed her. Lacey told the police that Tansy had threatened her before about going to the police about her drug dealing, so she believed that might have been what happened to Michelle.
All right, so there's our 3 suspects thus far. Let's jump to the police call. Days passed with police unable to reach Tansy for questioning, when they received a call from a nearby police station saying that they had a man call in with information about Michelle's murder, and he was worried he would soon meet his same fate. The man's name was Brian Holman, and he met with police after being promised protection. Right away, he said the murder was done with an ice pick. This is important because this was something that was not released to the public. Only the police would have known that an ice pick was used. Only a person involved with this would know that an ice pick was used. Brian also brought up Tansy and said he was hired by her as muscle, and Michelle was believed to be a snitch, and so she was dealt with by Tansy and her 2 other hired muscles known as David Richards and Brett Phillips, also known as Hollywood to the people in the area.
Okay, so after a couple days of watching Tansy's apartment, she was finally spotted by the police and arrested, and then shortly after, Hollywood was also arrested. So 3 weeks after the murder, we have 2 of our 3 main suspects in custody, with only Richards being the one out.
Next up, we have Hollywood's testimony. It only took 4 days in jail for Hollywood to fold and admit to knowing what happened to Michelle. He said they planned on kidnapping Michelle and killing her. Michelle knew all of these people because she also had a dark side, as we mentioned. She had been known to do drugs occasionally, maybe some recreational use, and some partying. Knowing this is how our 3 suspects were able to lure Michelle in. One day after Hollywood confessed, David Richards was found and arrested, bringing all involved into police custody.
Now, if I were to kidnap you, I would use the same thing. I would be like, hey, you want to go to a casino?
Some drugs, you're jumping in. Some casino.
All I got to do is say casino. You're jumping in.
Some drinking. I like gambling.
Yeah, I know.
Let's do it. Where are we going?
So, still something did not make sense. If she was attacked or killed for snitching, then why did the killers target her unborn baby? According to Hollywood, there was another person that told Tansy Michelle was going to go to the police, but he didn't know who it was. He only knew that the person rented a car and then gave it to Tansy to drive Michelle to the remote location. Police started to look into rental car businesses in the area, and they found out that Lacey Pavick actually rented a car matching the description of what they were looking for, and it turned out Lacey also worked at the dealership. So police then started to question coworkers, try to find out why she ran the car, and if her behavior had changed any since finding out about her husband's affair. So some of them mentioned that she had not been happy and changed as a person, mentioning that she wanted Michelle out of the picture. Now this led police to believe that Lacey may have been the head of the whole operation.
On March 31st, 2009, Lacey was arrested for her connection to the murder of Michelle 30 days after the body was found. Now, before we get into the trials, let's take a moment to look into the past of the person believed to be the mastermind behind a murder-for-hire plot. Lacey Hurst Pavick. She was born and raised in the town of Manasket, in a very well-known family in the area. Her parents owned a popular restaurant, so she grew up pretty well off. Despite being rich, she was not very liked by her peers growing up, especially by the other girls. After a failed marriage to her high school sweetheart, she took her 2 kids and with her, her well-known last name. With this, she got a job at the car dealership where she met Daniel Pavick. After 8 years together, they got married, so they had been together for quite a long time before Michelle came into the picture.
So we have our 4 people arrested, and we're going to get into our court hearings. 4 people charged for the murder of Michelle Kitterman and her unborn child. The judge posted their bonds, which were very different. So Richards, Phillips, Mathis, they were all set at $1 million, whereas the head of the operation was only set at $25,000. The judge's reason behind this was Lacey was from a well-known family, so she was not a flight risk. So her family was easily able to post that $25,000, and she was able to walk free without ever spending a day in jail.
Yeah, I thought this one was kind of interesting. I'd almost think it'd be the other way around. I would think if you were more well off, your bond would be higher. And for the opposing, I'm guessing these are lesser known players. I would almost think their bond would be a little lesser than. That's just the way the game works, I guess. If you're rich, you kind of get things like this in your favor.
Yep.
So out on bond, life went back to normal for Lacey. She continued on her marriage with her husband, and they were doing all the things they did before. This included public appearances in the same town that the Kitterman family lived. So you can imagine the frustration, the stresses of that. For an entire year, they watched this person who orchestrated Michelle's murder live freely, often seeing her at stores, shops, restaurants, and all that stuff.
So before Lacey was convicted, the other 3 people involved went through their own trials. First was Brett Hollywood Phillips. He pleaded guilty to first-degree murder, first-degree manslaughter, and he was given a plea deal for his witness testimonies towards the others involved, and that landed him 26 years in prison.
26 years, but not life. Chance to get out. Okay. So trial number 2, we have David Richards. David received a lesser charge than the others because he was not involved in the stabbing, just providing the weapon. So he received a second-degree murder charge, but also 26 years in prison. Again, no life, just 26 years with a chance to get out.
That's pretty interesting. So if you admit that you were involved in a murder, you get the same time as someone who was given the weapon that wasn't actually involved in it.
Yeah, guilty by association.
Yep. So trial number 3 was Tansy Mathis, and she was convicted of first-degree aggravated murder, first-degree manslaughter for the death of the unborn child, along with kidnapping and concealing evidence, and this landed her life without parole.
Okay. So we have the other two who, 26 years, but, someday, possibly, they may be free once again. But Tansy, she'll never be free. Life without parole. The Kitterman family had already been through 3 trials, but had one more to go. On November 1st, 2010, Lacey Hurst Pavick stood trial. Records show Lacey and Tansy had multiple meetings before renting the car. The rental was the key piece of evidence that was taken into a lab where blood and hair matched Michelle. The car, according to Lacey, was given to Tansy to help her out as she had been struggling. Now, as previously mentioned, Lacey's attitude at work had changed after the affair started, so a key testament from a coworker of hers said that she was told by Lacey that Michelle is a problem and would be taken care of by Monday. This was a week before the murder. So we went back on the calendar from that year, and the body was found on a Sunday. Police records show that Lacey was in contact with the killers the day after the murder happened. They also showed all 4 together before 3 of them split off in the time period the murder had happened. Her defense did not help very much. She tried to argue she wasn't involved with no actual evidence. After 15 days, the jury came back with a guilty verdict of murder and manslaughter, and she also got life without parole.
Yeah, so I wanted to mention those phone records, when the 3 of them split off, they also cut off. Like, there was no record of where they were. So they knew that this location they were taking her to had no cell service, so she wasn't able to reach out for help.
Okay, and that would explain the extremely remote location that you'd mentioned earlier. All right, so we have a very common theme here on 50 States, 50 Murders. And so far, almost all of our murderers have been dumbasses. And that's going to continue here today on episode 8. The mastermind behind this entire plot. She snitched on the person that she hired, which, interesting move, thinking that this would just simply never come back to haunt her. Also used against her in court was a piece of her own interrogation, where she had asked for the recording to simply stop so she could say something off the record. Obviously, that's not how police interrogations work. While on record, she had mentioned that she wanted Michelle and the baby both gone.
I wanted to close out here something that you didn't even have, so I wanted to spring this on you. It's what the prosecutors were able to come up with after, with all the evidence of a timeline of what actually happened. So after picking up Michelle, the 3 people involved drove to the remote road, and they forced her out of the car, and that's where Tansy began to stab her in the stomach in an attempt to kill the baby. So then she handed the ice pick to Hollywood and told him to finish the job. He then proceeded to stab her 30 times before leaving her body in the snow, but she was in fact not dead at this point. She managed to get on her feet, make her way down the road to get help, but she did not make it to the house before the weather got to her. She started to suffer from hypothermia, and when this happens, the body turns hot, so she began to take all of her clothes off. And when she couldn't make any further, she sat all on the ground, sat on her clothes, and that's where she was found, up against the fence.
Oh, man. That's terrible, because I have to imagine that that's just a very painful, suffering way to go out.
Yeah, I mean, she fought.
She did fight.
She was on, it was a mountain. It was a road on a mountain. She walked up a mountain, and she got to the end of the person's driveway.
Okay, so it actually wasn't even the stabs that took her life. It was the hypothermia that she suffered from due to the weather. Interesting. Wow. That is our case of the week in the Evergreen State of Washington. Dakota, we talked about a few things that you can do there, a few things to see. We talked about the music scene, the city of Seattle. You mentioned infamous murders that ran rampant in the 80s. And again, this case that we talked about today of Michelle Kitterman. As always, I want to get your take on we're ranking states as far as your desirability to visit. I think we might have a good one today. Washington looks like an awesome place to check out. Tell me what you think about Washington. What are some things you like? Maybe you saw some things I didn't mention. And ultimately, where do you rank Washington?
So yeah, you're right. This is up there. The Olympic National Park, it's a place that I do want to go. It's probably the most beautiful place. Maybe the whole world to me. I love.
Okay.
I was watching videos last night in preparation of this, just from the park, and it is quite amazing. Now, I didn't know about the San Juan Islands. That's pretty interesting. I don't think I would go kayaking, but I would love to see some orcas in the wild and not in a tank. So with that, I'm going to have to put this at number 4.
Oh, number 4. We got a top 10.
Yeah.
All right. So we have Colorado and Washington. 1 and 4. All right. It's nice to get a good state up there. Good. All right. Well, as we begin our departure from the state of Washington, in conclusion of episode 8 of 50 States, 50 Murders, we want to just continue thanking you, the listeners, for tuning in each and every week as we continue covering a new state as well as a murder case that happened to take place there.
If you've not already, please be sure to follow and subscribe, and be sure to tune in next week for episode 9.